Welcome back to Asian Art. In this lecture, we're going to look at the popular images that circulated in the floating world. And these are the ukiyo-e that you're most likely familiar with, the woodblock prints. To begin with, let's look at this place, the Yoshiwara, this place of culture where it was kind of a mingling of classes. People would come in disguise. The upper classes were really forbidden to go there, but they went nonetheless. And the merchants who were escaping their responsibilities. This is a place where people came, not too unlike Las Vegas. Sort of what happened in the Yoshiwara stayed in the Yoshiwara. This is a sentiment that is expressed in the poem by Isa. In this world, we walk on the roof of hell and look at the flowers. This idea of floating, a sense of euphoria, a sense of release, a sense of unresponsibility, and at the same time, certainly in a Confucian sense, any time you throw off all responsibility, you are sort of neglecting your obligations to friends and family. And so this place is kind of a fraught place, a place of artists, of celebrities, and of actors. Here we see a man making a woodblock print, and we're going to really focus on the kind of art that circulated among the people who visited the Yoshiwara. Prior to this, we've mostly looked at folding screens that were painted to look in these scenes of life in the Yoshiwara. A folding screen is a very expensive kind of work of art, a unique one-of-a-kind object that someone with a fair amount of money could afford. But most people who visited the Yoshiwara couldn't really afford that, and they wanted some memento or souvenir of their time, watching a play, visiting a geisha. These kinds of things would have required a little less expensive, something mass-produced. Still, though, something that had a really fine artistic sensibility. Woodblock printing had been around for a very long time. It was first developed in China, brought over from Korea, and then in Japan. In Japan, they developed a very fine and sophisticated use of this technique of woodblock printing to create multicolored blocks of art. The first thing an artist does is take a drawing and transfer it over onto a block of wood. And then they cut away everywhere where they do not want the ink to go. You can see it's kind of recessed here down away from the lines that make up the illustration. This drawing is put face down on the block of wood so that when it's printed, it will come out right side as intended. The first block that is cut like this is called the key block, and it is the main registered block that all other blocks, if there are other blocks, are kind of lined up with. Initially, woodblock prints were simply black and white illustrations. Here are two examples of woodblock prints of a geisha, something someone might buy as a souvenir. Here you can see the sort of classic style where the print of the kimono sort of lays flat against these sort of wild, curving, undulating forms of the kimono. The face is rendered in a very simple, iconic way, something fairly similar to the women's style of art of the Heian era, when we looked at the tale of Genji, that slit eyes and hooked nose kind of simplicity. But yet, despite the simplicity of the illustration, there is a wonderful personality that comes through in these images. So people would buy either an individual print as a memento, or they might actually buy a guidebook, such as the Mirror of Yoshiwara from 1659. This would have been sort of like your trip through the Hollywood Hills guidebook to all the celebrities and what they wear, and where you can find them. Now, again, the kind of illustrations you see in these scenes is definitely a kind of peering in the isometric perspective, the kind of roofless buildings, as they called it earlier. And again, people relaxing and just having a good time. It's not a formal picture. They're not performing. They're just going about their daily business. And we can see a sense of relaxation, a sense of pleasure that just exudes from these pictures. Now, this kind of peeking in, this voyeurism, you'll notice the folding screen in the upper right, like this is sort of behind closed doors, these sort of activities. This is part of the sort of sexuality that is latent in these pictures that we're seeing or peeking in on these sexy women's lives, and all their sort of lack of formal aware means that this is something that we, really shouldn't be seeing. There's a tradition in Japan, and here we're going back to this idea of a folding screen now, this called whose sleeves. It's just basically a rack for clothing, and it's a pair of kimonos, a man and a woman's, and they've been kind of tossed aside and not neatly folded. So somewhere, maybe on the other side of the screen, the lovers are naked, rolling around, and the kimonos are sort of the evidence of their bodies, their urgency to kind of throw off their kimonos and have at it. Sexuality in ukiyo-e was a way of kind of selling prints. It's a way that people went to these pictures and became a popular feature of a lot of the artwork in the ukiyo-e. One of the ways in which they were able to sell more prints was to thematically group them together. And then they began to tell stories. So we evolved from individual pictures to sets of pictures which are thematically linked. You want to buy a subscription, get them all. Or they now would actually have a narrative that followed through the whole set of pictures. Here's one of the early examples of one of these narrative sets. And it tells the story of the elegant and horny Manimo. This is the last picture in the series. And it's a story of a man who is on a journey to the Yoshiwara. And on his way there, he stops at a shrine and he says a prayer. Now, this sounds exactly like a no play, right? And when he says this prayer, he says a prayer to the goddesses of love. They appear before him. They ask him what they could do for him. And he says he wants to witness all the great lovers of the Yoshiwara. And so they make him really small. And you can see Manimon now in the picture up in the tree. He's been peering in on this scene of lovers, and he's caught this patron of the geisha, who is now fondling the geisha's assistant. This is very bad form. And the geisha is looking at him with daggers. In fact, they all look like they smell something a little off. And that may be because Manimon up in the tree is farting. So this is a rather risque, playful, silly story that has all kinds of elements that are very similar to what we might see in a comic book, including dialogue and narration and things like that. It's not a comic book, and this is not manga, but it's a precursor to that. And it would be a part of what evolves much later into manga in another couple of centuries. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the Edo period, Japan was closed off to the outside world. No one was allowed out, no one was allowed in. There was one small exception to that, and that was this island of Dutch settlers on Dijima. And this place is where the Dutch continued to trade with Japan. And Dutch goods slowly trickled into Japan. And as the Dutch goods circulated into Japan, Dutch art and engravings especially might appear, and Japanese artists became sort of fascinated by these exotic wonders of the outside world art by the Dutch. And one was this idea of still lifes or landscapes in a very different style, in a very different mode, using this visual trick the Europeans called perspective. All of these are things that were kind of new and exciting and exotic, and Utagawa Toyoharu made a study of them and began to introduce them into his work. Here is the island of Nagasaki, where Dijima can be found off the coast. So the landscape images that the Japanese were fascinated by, and here is a Japanese copy of a European engraving, is this way in which perspective allowed you to see the world from a kind of remove. They now could see this idea of vanishing point, and they loved the way that it kind of made sense. The pictures kind of had this depth, like you were looking into this world. And so as they began to sort of experiment with this idea of foreshortening and dropping back into the distant horizons, they began to call these pictures, these perspective pictures, floating pictures. And this seemed like a perfect fit for ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, to use this new visual trick perspective, which was also called floating. One of the artists who employed this perspective in his work with a great mastery is the artist Hiroshiga, who was famous for his extraordinary landscapes. Hiroshiga is a remarkable artist, not only for the sense of depth that he creates in his landscapes, but that he also, at the same time, creates this kind of flatness. Notice how we're looking through this crook of these trees, and the branches move out and block our view. In fact, the leaves come down and they cross over right at the point where they are at the most distant place. And in fact, if you look closely, it looks like the edge of the leaves is sort of making up the mountain range. So in a sense, he's kind of creating this huge space and flattening at the same time. He's aware of what perspective can do to create space, but then he's also cutting it back and flattening it. This little trick of space is further explored, where right above that in these leaves you'll see some birds flying in a flock that also looks like a branch. So again, that sense of closeness and distance playing off those two in a single image. Here's another very famous image by Hiroshiga of people walking in a garden in the springtime. And it's wonderful framing, the way the tree trunk cuts across the panels, and then these spring growth shoots upward with these beautiful explosions of color and this lovely sunset colors that wash down on the horizon. This was a print that made its way to Europe, where it inspired Vincent van Gogh to try his hand at copying it. Van Gogh was, of course, a man who was really deeply enamored of Japanese art, and especially woodblock prints, and he took it upon himself to study their use of color and forms and applied them to his own work. Perhaps the most famous pieces by Hiroshiga was his 53 stages on the Tokaido. Now, as I mentioned before, I mentioned earlier, there was this way in which they were trying to create sets of images based on a theme or an idea so that people wouldn't just buy one print, but people would feel more obligated to buy a larger set. So here is a set of 53 images where Hiroshiga is describing a whole journey from the city of Edo all the way down south to Kyoto. And this journey would have been well known to many of the residents. It was a major sort of thoroughfare through the wilderness. It would take several months to complete, and it would be something that a large royal household would have to take all their servants and all their wares on this journey. And that's what you see here is these the exit of Edo, leaving the city, and the beginning of the journey. Here it is in the early morning. They're starting their journey outward. And of course, these are the gates that everyone would know be your first step on your journey. Here is later in the journey, and again, you can see this beautiful landscape. The travelers are sort of in the upper left corner of the picture, walking along this cliff edge, and we can see the way the boats sail outward. He's using this sort of asymmetrical composition, which was popularized in China many centuries before this, but this wonderful sense of kind of space that he creates. And of course, the very iconic volcano, the Mount Fuji that is hanging there with its lovely images, sort of picks the slope and brings the sky into the earth. Hiroshiga was a great master of the art of landscape, and he worked very hard to this. His chief rival and his senior in this, probably the most celebrated of all ukiyo-e artists, was none other than Hokusai. Now, the fact we call this one artist Hokusai is a convention that we have used to sort of simplify his actual history. Here on this long list are all the names he went by during his lifetime. He changed his name slightly less often as he changed his home residence. He moved about and changed his name so often. He was a restless man. He did not dedicate himself to any one kind of illustration or art. He moved freely between landscape and still life and botanical prints and bird images and horror images and erotic images and children's images. Everything and anything seemed to take his interest, and he was an exceptional artist in everything he put his hand to. This is by far his most famous image, one that immediately gained him great reputation and success, is from a series of landscape images called the 36 Views of Mount Fuji. Here again, the mountain Fuji, the volcano, is sort of slightly off center, and it is sort of a peak that appears like a wave. Is that in it's a way that it echoes the forms of the waves, creating again a sense of great distance and flatness. And then these boats beautifully that sort of cut through this giant wave that's surging off. This Kanagawa is a region off the coast where it is well known for its gigantic waves. And so this would have been something that folklore that people would have been familiar with. And this is a very important difference between, say, Chinese landscape and Japanese landscape. Chinese landscape aspired toward idealistic visions of nature. not particular ones, not actual places, but sort of the idealized versions of those places that were visualized for their perfect feng shui. In Japan, they idealize things, but there always is a clear reference back to some very specific place that people would recognize as something about the lore and legacy. And this sort of attachment to actual places, again, I believe is a sort of a Shinto idea on the way in which things, particular places are associated with specific histories and deities. Here is another one of Hokusai's incredible prints from his collection, A Gathering of 100 Supernatural Tales. And again, the theme here is horror stories. He did a series of images of horror stories based on a parlor game with Buddhist themes that people would tell these sort of ghost stories, and they would try and spook each other out. Each story would be told, and at the end of the story, they would blow out a candle until at the very end, the last ghost story would be told, and someone would blow out the very last candle. Hokusai is famous for lots of things. One in particular is his popularizing this word manga. Manga begins in China. It's a word that's used to describe sort of casual sketching. It literally translates into irresponsible pictures or spontaneous or doodles, sort of things. And Hokusai used this word manga to talk about a collection of pictures that he had made and published rather cheaply in these booklets that he wanted to sell to people as sort of guides to drawing, encouraging people to kind of find inspiration in his drawings and use them as guides in order to learn how to draw. Hokusai probably undertook this project as a way to kind of promote himself as a teacher of art, as it was a fairly lucrative side business from being an artist at this time. And it was also a way to kind of show off his extraordinary range of ability in drawing. So his students produced some of these images more and more, and they were part of a set of 15 volumes of sketchbooks he would eventually produce. Hokusai's manga were very popular, and they were one of the very first books to be brought out of Japan and published in Germany around the early 1800s. Hokusai here shows his interest in modern machinery, demons, dances, anything and everything that was happening in the world. He had a sketch for it. Here we see a series of pages where Hokusai is showing us a collection of faces of blind people. This is one of the extraordinary things about Hokusai, that he can reveal the humanity, the humor, and the extraordinary complexity of people who are blind. Now, it is important to note that though Hokusai used the word manga in his works, to describe his sketches, these are not manga in the way we understand the word today. The word manga is typically associated with comic books, which tell a story, and Hokusai's manga do not. The word manga is used in that context in the 20th century.